The rain had already stopped by the time the courier reached the wolf's lair. But the forest around Hitler's East Prussian headquarters still dripped with water, as if the trees themselves were sweating under the weight of what was coming. It was August 1944, and somewhere far to the west, the German army was coming apart. The young Wehrmacht officer sent from Berlin looked older than he should have. His boots were caked with mud. His uniform was stained with soot, rain, and the grime of a Reich that was beginning to collapse under the pressure of a two-front war. Chained to his wrist was a leather dispatch case marked for immediate delivery. He had not been told what was inside. He did not need to be. The urgency of the journey told him enough. The news from France was catastrophic. Inside the conference bunker, Adolf Hitler stood over a map of France that seemed to change faster than his staff could update it. His hands were clasped behind his back. His shoulders sagged slightly now, as though the strain of the war had begun to leave a permanent bend in his posture. His left hand was trembling again. He pressed it against the small of his back to hide it from the officers gathered around him. The symbols on the map had been moving in the wrong direction for weeks. German formations that were supposed to be holding the line were instead drifting eastward, then disappearing altogether. Entire divisions had gone from battered to scattered to gone. Hitler looked different now than he had in the years of victory. His face was paler, more hollow. The skin beneath his eyes had darkened from sleepless nights spent in underground rooms like this one. Even his mustache seemed grayer than it had a month earlier. When he shifted his weight, it was often with the subtle caution of a man no longer certain that his body would obey him instantly. Those around him had noticed the change. His rages lasted longer now, and when they ended, they left him drained. The room itself smelled of damp concrete, stale tobacco, and the sour underground stillness of men who lived too long below the earth. Wilhelm Keitel stood at Hitler's right, rigid as ever, though his eyes revealed what his posture did not: exhaustion. Alfred Jodl stood at a side table sorting reports, glancing up at the map with the expression of a man who already knew the pattern and feared hearing it spoken aloud. Outside the bunker, beyond the minefields, the fences, and the armed guards, Europe was being transformed. The Normandy landings had been shocking enough. What came after was worse. The German army that had overrun France in 6 weeks in 1940 was now being taken apart by an enemy that seemed to move too fast to be pinned down, too fast to be blocked, too fast even to be understood. Then the adjutant entered. He carried the dispatches from Berlin and stepped forward carefully, as if approaching a wild animal. Hitler took the documents without looking at him. For a moment he kept his eyes fixed on the map, as if sheer will might force the symbols backward. Then he began to read. Around the room, the officers recognized the signs immediately. A flush rising in the cheeks, the jaw tightening, the breath becoming sharper, shallower. The reports described the continuing collapse of German positions in France, divisions cut off, panzer formations mauled from the air, command posts overrun, supply depots lost before they could be evacuated. But it was not the scale of the losses that made Hitler's hands begin to shake. It was the pattern. Again and again the reports circled back to the same name: General George S. Patton. For weeks, German intelligence had been tracking him. The moment Patton took command of the newly activated American Third Army, the entire character of the campaign in France had changed. This was no longer a slow, methodical expansion from the Normandy beaches. It had become something else, something fluid, something violent, something relentless. Patton's army did not simply advance, it accelerated.
It moved with a rhythm that seemed to disrupt every German attempt to react. Every time German commanders thought they understood where the main blow was falling, Patton's columns appeared somewhere else. Every time they began building a new defensive line, American armor was already pushing through a weak point, or sliding around the flank, or cutting the roads in the rear. The Abwehr had compiled thick files on Patton dating back to North Africa. The assessments called him reckless, profane, brilliant, egotistical, dangerous. After Sicily, some analysts had assumed his career was finished, destroyed by scandal after the slapping incidents became public in the United States. Hitler himself had dismissed him as an example of democratic weakness, the sort of talented commander that a soft political system would cast aside. But that assumption had been disastrously wrong. Patton had not been broken, he had been held back, used as a decoy, and now, in France, he had been unleashed. The intelligence reports described American tanks appearing in sectors they should not yet have reached. German supply lines severed before headquarters even realized they were threatened. Entire formations discovering that enemies who had been 50 miles away just days earlier were now in their rear. Hitler raised his eyes from the dispatches and slowly scanned the faces in the room. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled. He asked whether they understood what was happening in France, whether they understood what these reports meant. Keitel began offering a tactical explanation. Hitler cut him off with a sharp motion of the hand. He stepped toward the map and stabbed a finger into the positions marked for Patton's Third Army. The Americans had broken out of the Normandy hedgerows and were racing across France with a speed that seemed impossible for a force of that size. They were covering in days what should have taken weeks. They were moving faster, Hitler said bitterly, than the Wehrmacht had moved in 1940. But it was not merely speed. It was coordination, timing, control. German commanders in the field were reporting the same thing again and again. They could not establish a position before American forces were already flanking it. They could not organize a counterattack before their supply line was cut. They could not concentrate reserves before those reserves were themselves threatened. Jodl cautiously suggested that perhaps the reports overstated the pace. American logistics could not possibly sustain such an advance. Hitler turned on him instantly. How many divisions, he demanded, would have to be destroyed before the General Staff accepted what was in front of them? Patton's army was not simply advancing, it was orchestrating the battlefield. Germany was no longer dictating events in France. Germany was reacting, and reacting too slowly. Hitler began to pace. His movement was abrupt, uneven, agitated. He spoke now not just about France, but about war itself, about tempo, initiative, momentum. He reached back to 1918, claiming that even as a corporal he had understood that modern war was no longer about static lines alone. It was about forcing the enemy into decisions faster than he could make them. There were moments, he said, when one army imposed its will so completely that the other ceased to act and only reacted. That had been Germany's strength in 1940. Now it was happening in reverse. He stopped at the map and leaned hard against the table. In 1940, German armored forces had broken through France so rapidly that the Allied command structure had failed under the stress. Orders arrived too late. Reserves went to sectors that were already lost. Defensive lines were formed only to be outflanked before they were occupied. Hitler remembered that campaign vividly. He had studied it obsessively. Speed, concentration, breakthrough, exploitation, momentum. Those were the principles. For years they had brought him victory. Poland, France, Yugoslavia, the first great months in Russia. Again and again, those campaigns seemed to prove that the side which seized the tempo controlled the war. Now, he said, the same thing was happening to Germany, but this time the roles were reversed. Patton had seized the initiative, and he was wielding it like a weapon. Every attempt to stabilize the front created new vulnerabilities before the line could even settle. Reinforcements sent to one sector arrived only in time to be cut off. Every German move was becoming a response to an American move that had already changed again by the time the response was ready. An aide entered with fresh reports from Army Group B. Hitler snatched them from his hand and read in silence. His face reddened. Again, the same story. Patton's army breaking through at multiple points, American armor ignoring strong points and driving instead for road hubs, rail junctions, fuel depots, command centers, the bloodstream and nervous system of the German front. And now Hitler said it plainly. Patton was not fighting a conventional campaign of occupation and consolidation. He was fighting a campaign of disruption. His army moved too quickly for the German command structure to respond. It struck too many points at once for reserves to be effectively committed. It bypassed resistance instead of reducing it. It treated static defense as irrelevant. And what made it worse, much worse, was that Patton seemed to understand the German command system itself. He knew how long it took for a division commander to report a threat. How long it took for Corps headquarters to verify it, how long it took for Army Group staff to authorize movement, how long it took for reserves to physically arrive, and he used every minute of that delay. By the time the Germans recognized a probe, Patton had already turned it into a breakthrough. By the time reinforcements were moving, he had already changed direction. By the time the defense was organized, it was defending empty ground. Hitler lifted one of the tactical maps closer to his face and stabbed at a point south of Avranches. Here, he said, was the perfect example. A German infantry division had been ordered to establish a blocking position to contain the American breakout. It had taken 2 days to reach the sector, entirely reasonable by the standards of traditional warfare. But by the time the division arrived, Patton's armor had already passed through, driven 40 miles beyond it, and cut the railway that division needed for resupply. The position had been bypassed before it even existed. Then came the bitterest irony of all. This, Hitler said, is blitzkrieg. This was Germany's own doctrine, the concept that had brought victory after victory in the early years of the war. But Patton had taken it, refined it, accelerated it, and turned it into something even more devastating. He understood that tempo itself was a weapon, that moving faster than the enemy could think was more powerful than artillery. Keitel tried again to speak of reinforcements. Hitler waved him off. Reinforcements would make no difference if Patton still controlled the tempo. Any force sent west would arrive piecemeal, be thrown into battle before concentration, and be destroyed in detail by an enemy already operating inside the German decision cycle. Hitler pointed out movement after movement. The 4th Armored Division cutting a rail line and overrunning fuel stores. The 6th Armored Division seizing a bridge before German engineers could blow it. Everywhere, American forces probing, bypassing, accelerating, never stopping long enough for the defense to catch up. Then Hitler turned to the human dimension. German soldiers were not being destroyed mainly in heroic last stands. They were being exhausted, disoriented, cut off, broken apart by an enemy that never stopped long enough to let them recover. Unit cohesion was dissolving, not simply because of casualties, but because men no longer believed the line in front of them meant anything. Captured American soldiers, Hitler noted bitterly, spoke of Patton with fear and admiration in equal measure. He drove them brutally, demanded constant movement, accepted no excuses, but he delivered results. And his men could see those results every day in the miles gained, the towns taken, the enemies bypassed. Hitler fell silent. Then, more quietly than before, he admitted what almost no one in the room expected him to say. He had underestimated Patton. They all had. German intelligence had identified him as aggressive and talented, but they had not understood the full extent of his grasp of modern mechanized warfare. Patton understood something many German commanders no longer seemed to. In mobile war, time was terrain. To move faster than the enemy could react was the modern equivalent of taking the high ground. When the breakout from Normandy began, most commanders would have paused, consolidated, organized logistics, prepared methodically for the next phase. Patton did the opposite. He pushed immediately. He accepted risk. He accepted the possibility that his spearheads might outrun their supplies because he understood that preserving momentum mattered more than preserving order. And the gamble had worked. The Americans had moved so fast that German units were unraveling before they could establish defenses. Patton had forced the German command into a permanent state of emergency. Jodl asked whether there had ever been historical precedents for movement at such speed. Hitler gave a sharp, humorless laugh. Of course there had been precedents. Napoleon at Lee in the Valley Campaign, the German thrust through Belgium in 1914, and more recently the Wehrmacht itself in Poland and France. But Patton had advantages none of those commanders possessed. Motorized logistics that could keep pace, air superiority that shielded his columns, radio communications that coordinated movements across vast distances in real time. Combined with Patton's aggression, these advantages had created something new, a form of warfare operating at a tempo faster than traditional command hierarchies could handle. By the time a German corps commander identified one threat and requested reinforcements, Patton had already created another somewhere else. Hitler sat down heavily. For a moment he looked older than his 55 years. He spoke then about his own belief, his lifelong belief that willpower could overcome material disadvantage, that determination and fighting spirit could defeat larger but softer enemies. But Patton, he said bitterly, had found a way to neutralize willpower itself. It did not matter how brave German soldiers were if they were encircled before they could occupy a position. It did not matter how determined tank crews were if they ran out of fuel before the enemy appeared. Communications intercepts from American units were read aloud. Again and again they revealed the same thing. Patton's language was harsh, impatient, relentless. But the core idea repeated itself over and over. Keep moving. Bypass resistance. Do not stop. Speed, speed, speed. The American general understood instinctively what Hitler himself had once believed, that hesitation was death in mechanized warfare, that the side that paused to consolidate would become the side forced to react. Hitler returned to the map one more time and studied the projected German positions. He began issuing orders, then stopped. What orders were left? Move faster? The units were already moving as fast as they could, but reactively, not decisively. Stand and fight? Patton would simply go around them. Withdraw to stronger positions? There were no strong positions against an enemy moving faster than the defender could retreat. His frustration exploded. Where were the panzer divisions that had once terrified Europe? How had German mobile warfare been surpassed by Americans who had barely possessed an army a few years earlier? Keitel began explaining fuel shortages, numerical inferiority, air superiority. Hitler snapped back that material did not explain tempo. The Americans were not faster simply because they had more trucks. They were faster because Patton had built an army to move fast, a command structure that made decisions at the speed of mobile war. subordinates trained to believe that speed mattered more than security. The reports continued into the evening. Patton's army was not merely advancing, it was accelerating, and the acceleration itself was creating a self-reinforcing cycle. The faster the Americans moved, the less time Germany had to build defenses. The weaker those defenses became, the faster the Americans moved. Soon, the Seventh Army was no longer a coherent front so much as a scattering of units trying to retreat before the Americans cut them off. That, Hitler realized, was the deeper significance of losing the Tempo War in France. It was not only about territory, it was about the loss of initiative across the entire Western Front. Every German division reacting to Patton was a division that could not be used for planned offensive action elsewhere. Every reserve fed piecemeal into France was a reserve gone forever. And perhaps worst of all, German officers and soldiers were learning something poisonous, that they could not match the Americans in mobile warfare anymore. That lesson, once learned, would spread. It would poison morale. It would infect decision-making. It would turn a once aggressive army into a reactive one. As night deepened over East Prussia, Hitler dismissed most of his staff, but kept Jodl and a few aides beside him. The reports through the darkness were relentless. More penetrations, more encirclements, more withdrawals. Eventually, even Hitler stopped speaking of the front in France as collapsing. It had already collapsed. What remained were fragments, rear guards, pockets, scattered resistance. At one point, near midnight, a report arrived stating that elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division had advanced more than 100 miles in less than 4 days. Hitler read it. Then he did something his staff almost never saw. He laughed, not with amusement, with bitterness. Patton, he said, was making the Wehrmacht look like old men, like generals from another century, like an army trained to fight at a speed the modern battlefield had already surpassed. In the final hours before dawn, Hitler studied everything he could find on Patton: intelligence summaries, biographical notes, campaign analyses from North Africa and Sicily. And what he found disturbed him even more. Patton was not merely instinctive, he was studied. He had read military history deeply. He understood not just what great commanders had done, but why they had done it. His belief in relentless offensive action, in preserving momentum above all else, sounded disturbingly familiar to Hitler, because those were ideas Hitler himself had once championed. Now they were being used against Germany, and used better. As the first weak morning light filtered into the bunker, Hitler stood over the map one last time. Patton's spearheads had created a deep salient. In theory, it was exposed. In theory, a counterattack from north and south might cut it off. But Hitler knew it would never happen. The forces needed were scattered, under strength, short of fuel. And even if they could be assembled, Patton would move faster than the German planning cycle. He always did. At last, Hitler spoke what none of them wanted to hear. Germany had lost the Tempo War in the West. It had lost it to a general who understood modern mechanized warfare better than Germany's own commanders, and who had built an army capable of operating at a speed the Wehrmacht could no longer match. And once an army lost control of tempo, it lost control of the battle itself. Defense was reactive. Reaction could not seize initiative. And Germany no longer had the reserves for decisive offensive action. As the sun rose over the dripping East Prussian forest, Hitler left the bunker slowly, shoulders hunched, left hand trembling. Behind him, his staff began updating the maps again. Another day of retreat, another day of reaction, another day of being late. The war would continue for 9 more months, but in that bunker, On that wet August morning in 1944, Hitler had grasped a truth he could not reverse. Germany was being defeated by its own doctrine, wielded by an enemy who had learned it better than its creators. The tempo of war had shifted, and all the willpower in the world could not force it back. Patton had seized the initiative in France, and he would not give it up.